Clarkson. Tonight we report on a secret CIA research project carried out in Montreal in which mental patients felt they were used as the CIA's guinea pigs.
They kept you asleep for 23 days. While I was asleep, they were shocking the heck out of me with electric shocks.
George Reeves, who played Superman, was shot down and killed in his Beverly Hills home. Cops called it suicide, and just about all of us accepted that judgment. But now a group of several dozen friends of George Reeves and fans of Superman are challenging that assessment. They say Reeves did not kill himself, that he was gunned down in cold blood because of some extracurricular romance.
Those who were involved were trying to find out something about brainwashing. Yes, this is the reason that we were interested in Dr. Cameron's work.
Jonathan Corwin House, one of the most notorious witchcraft judges.
100 people had been imprisoned, and 14 women and 6 men had been executed.
Hello everyone, my name is Hailey Elizabeth, and if you don't know who I am, I post videos talking about conspiracy theories, controversial people, true crime, and all things spooky, scary skeletons. So if you're interested in any of that, you can subscribe. But this specific video is going to be about conspiracy theories. I really love making these videos. I love researching for them. I like doing them. I like talking about them. Oh, I forgot to turn on my light. Oh, cool. Now you can actually see my face. Before we continue into the rest of today's video, I do want to give a big thank you to HelloFresh for sponsoring this video. If you guys don't know what HelloFresh is America's #1 meal kit that includes fresh, pre-measured ingredients delivered right to your home to make cooking easy, fun, and affordable. HelloFresh offers delicious recipes that accommodate with any diet like vegetarian, pescatarian, low-cal, and carb-smart. HelloFresh also has more 5-star review meals than any other meal kit, and all of its ingredients work directly with farmers, so you know what you're getting is extremely fresh. Now, as y'all may or may not know, I cannot cook. I was literally living off of grilled cheese and cereal before HelloFresh, so shout out to HelloFresh for keeping me healthy. The recipes are very easy to follow along with it, and it genuinely makes me excited to cook every night knowing that I already have all of the ingredients with no stress. HelloFresh cuts out stressful meal planning so you can get dinner on the table in just 30 minutes. Considering an average shopping trip takes about 41 minutes, and with these pre-measured ingredients, there is no wasted food. In fact, HelloFresh's carbon footprint is 25% less than those compared to a store-bought groceries. You can also change your meal kit to fit your liking, such as changing food preferences, skipping a week, or changing delivery dates. HelloFresh has donated over 4 million meals to charity in 2020 amid the coronavirus crisis, and still continues to step up their food donations. All you need to do is go to HelloFresh.com and use my code HaileyElizabeth14, and you get 14 free meals along with free shipping. Like, for example, say you want to go on a family trip, but you don't want to keep on making all of those grocery trips to the store every night when you could easily be using that time to spend time with your family. HelloFresh also offers meals that can feed up to 4 people. So you just bring that along, and then there you go. The fully prepared, pre-measured meals, good for the entire family. Again, that is HaileyElizabeth14 at HelloFresh.com. You will get 14 meals free along with free shipping. And thank you so much to HelloFresh for sponsoring this video. Okay. Now back to the video. Very first topic that we're going to get into is the topic that I find most interesting. That is Project MKUltra. In the 50s and 60s during the Cold War, the US thought that the Soviets and the Chinese were using governmental brainwashing their US prisoners. So like US soldiers would go to foreign countries, some of them as spies, and then when they were kidnapped and made prisoners, they thought that they were actually brainwashing their prisoners, brainwashing them as a form of mind control in order to like get the US people on their side and also reveal any information that they needed. This was all like speculated, like no one knew for sure, and the US was like, oh, well, if everyone else is doing it, let's do it 10 times worse. So in 1953, they approved of Project MKUltra, which contained about 150 people, some volunteers, some had no idea what they were signing up for. People from the military, some of them were prisoners, so like they really didn't have a choice in whether or not they wanted to pursue this experiment because they were a prisoner. They really had barely any rights. They basically tried a ton of things on these subjects, such as drugs, paralytics, and electroshock therapy, trying to figure out new ways on how to control the human mind and use it as sort of a weapon. So if they have an alleged spy come to the US, they can kidnap that spy and use these tactics to get out confidential information that the US needs to know. So the sole purpose of the experiment was basically to just see how much free will a human was willing to give up and how much of the mind they were really able to control. One of the tests that they would use on these subjects was called psychic driving, where basically they would dose their patients with LSD, and it wasn't like the type of, you know, groovy LSD. During the 60s, LSD was not as popular as it is now. Like, it was a very, very foreign drug. It was a drug that actually like the government made, give to their patients, so they thought that maybe if they were on a lot of LSD, then they were able to control their mind because they are more vulnerable. Of course, when people took this LSD, if you ever know anything about it, you know that you get a lot of like crazy hallucinogens, you don't really know what's going on, you get very paranoid, and this is exactly what the CIA agents wanted to see from these patients. They wanted to see them scared and paranoid because, again, if they were scared and paranoid, that would make them a lot easier to control. Another test of psychic driving included electroshock therapy. Basically, they would hook pads up to your brain and shock your brain so much that your brain sort of like melts. A lot of people confirm that they lost a lot of memories while doing this test. Some even reverted all the way back to a toddler state of mind, and some even had to be re-potty trained, and then they could build their brain back up again, kind of raising them like a soldier. I don't know, it literally is so crazy. And there were a lot of people that had no clue what they were signing up for. Another form of psychic driving would be a medically induced coma. You put people in a medically induced coma and keep them there for weeks while playing them like recorded messages, sort of as a way to like allow those messages to hit the subconscious, so then when they wake up they will have all of these messages in their subconscious brain and kind of work for the CIA, sort of as like a robot spy, I guess. Unfortunately, some got all three of them: electroshock, LSD, and the medically induced coma. The second category of these testings was also hypnosis. If the man is, you know, performing hypnosis on a patient and he says, okay, every time I say let's race, you pick up the bomb and place it in the red dot or something. To break from his hypnosis, they would test these theories out, and they were most of the time very much correct. So that was also another form of this like human mind control. And around this time when they started experimenting with hypnosis, they actually started bringing in more test subjects, but now it was mostly mental hospital patients. Since mental hospital patients didn't really have the best of headspace, again, they would be easier to control because their mind wasn't strong enough. Extremely like very, very sad, very, very messed up. It would even bring not just humans but also animal test subjects, implant things in a dog's brain, and they thought that maybe if they got into a dog's brain it would be easier because dogs don't really have the comprehension as humans do, but surprisingly it was actually a lot harder. The only thing they could really get the dogs to do, make the dog walk in a square through a remote control, testing these dogs as if they were like a remote control car. So at this point the hypnosis wasn't really working, neither was the dogs, and neither was like the electroshock therapy. The electroshock was helping because it would kind of like dump people's brains down and then allow them to build back up again, but that whole process of building the brain back up again just takes so much work, and they realized the only thing that was really working for them was the LSD, and so they decided to more experiment with drugs and how that could be used as a weapon for mind control. They would create substances that would heavily induce mental confusion. If they were ever in a situation where they had to lie and they were given this drug, their brain would just be so foggy and confused that it wouldn't even be able to fabricate a lie. And so that was one of the drugs that they made and was successful in making. On top of all of that, they just continue using the same drugs as I said earlier, the ones that would erase your memory. Or if you can hear the waterfall behind me, someone just hopped in the shower. I know, how dare they? How how dare someone get clean during my video making? That's so rude. If they did get something out of them that they really wanted to hear, use this drug to erase the memory and erase the conversation that they just had. So that was, again, another drug that they tried out and was successful with. It wasn't until 1957 they found a psychiatrist from Canada named Donald Cameron, specialized in like the human brain, and so he teamed up with the CIA of the US to kind of bring this mind control practice outside of the grounds of New York. They thought that maybe if they got some Canadian test subjects, then they could see if varied from place to place. So Donald Cameron conducted his own study in Montreal, and that is where he basically did the same thing as the US was doing, but now in Montreal, Canada. It was speculated that from the years of 1957 to 1964, he was paid over $500,000 to do so. Something very, very highly illegal is that the Canadian government had no idea that Donald was doing all of this, so if he was caught... So in 1973, 20 years into doing these testings, amid the Watergate scandal, I don't really know too much about it, but basically it had to do with the government figuring out all the shady stuff that was going on, because surprisingly, sometimes the government doesn't even know what its own government is doing. Amid the Watergate scandal and the government trying to keep a close eye on what exactly everyone was doing, they decided to pull the plug on MKUltra and burn all of the records and research associated with it, as well as just like releasing the patients. I have no clue why they thought that was gonna go well. Like, did they think people were just gonna be released and then like not say anything? It wasn't until about a year later in 1974 where the New York Times actually came out with an article and said that they speculated that during the 60s the CIA and FBI were conducting illegal human experimentation based on the victims that, you know, were released. So many people were going to the police and telling them about this. Kind of just went under the radar, you know, the police didn't really want to mess with any of this because it was too confidential. This article caught the attention of the US Congress, who then started to look more into the FBI and CIA. Vice President Nelson Rockefeller actually started the Rockefeller Commission, a team of people that tried to figure out what the CIA and FBI were doing to all of these innocent people. It was then that they found around 20,000 documents all about MKUltra. Those documents is what survived the fire, and all of these documents were incorrectly stored in financial record buildings, and that's exactly how they were able to find all of these documents. But 20,000 documents. Girl, like, just imagine how many were burned. Right? Like, did they even burn any? Upon their research, I guess the only decently good thing is that only 2 people died from this testing. And I say like that's decently good because with how vigorous and rough they were treating these patients, I'm very surprised that more didn't die. Actually, like, no one really knows if any more died. Just from the 20,000 documents that they were able to uncover, it was shown that only 2 people had died. Obviously, after all of this, the people that would probably know the most about it were the CIA and FBI agents. After they were questioned about what was actually going on, were hooked up to lie detector machines, and a lot of them said that they had no idea what actually happened and passed the test. What they think happened is that this drug that I was mentioning earlier that could kind of erase memories gave their agents that were most vulnerable or that they knew were going into questioning this drug, so then they would forget all about what happened at MKUltra, and then if they, you know, were hooked up to a lie detector machine, as they would pass the test. Then in the 1980s, about 20 years later, after all the patients were released, a lot of the patients from this experiment actually came together and tried to sue the CIA and FBI for what they had done to them, as well as the Canadian government, because this was also around the time where the Canadian government had figured out that they were actually illegally doing all of this testing on their own residents. The ruling of this case was dun dun dun, dismissed. Nothing really came from it except for they now made like a new law stating that you you must sign a consent form or at least a waiver before asserting yourself in these sort of situations that could be potentially dangerous. So if you ever go like zip lining or scuba diving, you have to sign like a waiver beforehand. This is why you have to sign that waiver. If you die or if you're traumatized, you legally can't come at us because we warned you. A lot of people were very mad about this situation while others were like, hey-o, wait, back it up. You said you were seeing mushrooms, hopping on clouds, and like having all these crazy trips. Hypothetically, if like we were to make it ourselves, do you know how we would like, you know, do that? In the 70s, the whole LSD obsession came out. It was more used as a weapon, and over the years, it's just kind of been used as like a party drug. You know, you see crazy stuff, you do crazy stuff. Now, regarding MKUltra conspiracy theories, I couldn't really find anything like specific. There's just like a bunch of conspiracy theories about what was on the documents, how many people they had actually tested on, because 150 is a little bit of a low number, and a lot of people were speculating that there was probably a lot more than they were saying. As for the reasoning, we already know the reasoning, so like there's nothing really much to uncover or unpack there. But my next two topics, very heavily conspiracy theory induced. The disappearance of actor George Reeves, aka Superman. George Brewer was born on January 5th, 1914 in Iowa. He was born about 5 months into his parents' marriage, and then shortly after George was born, the parents got a divorce. George and his mother moved from Iowa to Galesburg, Illinois. He moved to Pasadena, California, because that is where the mother's sister lived, and they wanted to live with her for the time being. It was actually in California where George started to find his love for acting. He started to do musical theater at the Pasadena Playhouse, and that is actually where he was discovered by a casting director and signed with Warner Brothers in 1939, and even got a minor role in the big hit film Gone with the Wind. In 1943, he actually got a lead in a movie called So Proudly We Hail. After that movie was released, he was really on the road to success in his career, but unfortunately, that was around the time where he had to be sent off to war. So when he came back to war, he really didn't have any motivation to continue professional acting and like learn lines and do scripts. So instead, he resorted to live television. Then in 1952, he actually got his role to be Superman in the hit series Adventures of Superman. This was his breakout role. This is what he was most known for, and he actually got extremely famous because of it. Unfortunately, since this is the 50s, the entertainment industry wasn't really seen as a real job back then, so they wouldn't pay their people a lot. You know, contrary to now, you see like huge celebrities living in big mansions and living luxury. A lot of actors actually had to work very odd jobs just to make ends meet, even though they could be the lead in like a hit movie or TV show. In George's situation, he was very famous, but not very rich. He would do odd jobs to make ends meet, showing up at premieres dressed as Superman, and people had to pay for, you know, pictures and autographs. And he would also perform in wrestling matches, again dressed as Superman. And in 1959, he had hit his mark for performing over 100 episodes of The Adventures of Superman. It was also around this time where he started to date this woman named Leonore, and this woman he actually only dated for about 5 months until it was said that they were planning on to be married. On June 15th of 1959, George and Leonore had actually left the house to go on a date night and left behind their friend Robert Corden in the house. He was actually writing a book about George, and so he lived at the house. He was a writer. They left around 6 p.m. and then they didn't get home until around 11 p.m. Then at 12 a.m., that is when George had actually decided to, you know, call it a night, go up to bed. But something weird about this situation is that prior to George going to bed, he actually turned on his porch light instead of turning it off, off. And back in the 50s, when your porch light was on, that was kind of an invitation of like, oh, we are accepting guests. I wasn't born in the 50s, so I don't know. That just sounds, oh, if someone's porch light is on, that means you could just like walk in. Actually, this invitation worked because two neighbors by the names of William and Carol actually came over to the house and started to have drinks with Robert and Leonore. George came downstairs angry because everybody was just kind of like chilling at his home, drinking his drinks, sitting in the living room. Like, he didn't want guests, and so he was getting very aggravated, and he even threatened to throw William out of his house. Everybody was just kind of laughing at him, calling him a grump and that he doesn't know what he's talking about. All four people were downstairs. It was around 1 a.m. and George sort of gave up. He was like, you know what, they're not gonna leave. And so they all started laughing at him because he was getting super aggravated. And it was said by all four of the people, Leonore, Robert, Carol, and William, that after this argument, William walked upstairs, went to his room, they heard his bedside drawer open up, and then they heard a gunshot. William ran upstairs and saw George's naked, dead body laying on the bed. When the police showed up, there was a lot of conclusions made, such as, the weird thing about it is that the gunshot went through his right temple. The bullet casing was underneath his body. He was completely naked. The gun was on the floor in between his legs. He was laying back on the bed. But when they look up at the ceiling, there was blood splattered on the ceiling as well as the actual bullet lodged in the ceiling. Now, there are many theories as to what happened exactly, but the very first theory, and this is actually the theory that the LA coroners went with, in that it was a suicide. LA coroners just decided to deem it as a suicide because they said that the path of the bullet as well as the blood splatters and the placement of everything would make sense in a suicide. The only thing that really didn't make sense was the fact that he was naked. If you're in that mind state, you wouldn't really be thinking about or caring about like getting your clothes dirty at all. Despite all of the odd inconsistencies, the LA coroners as well as the police department just deemed it as a suicide because it's a lot easier than looking at it as a murder case. And the creepiest part about all of this, as I said earlier, like they were all kind of arguing, but everyone was kind of laughing at George because he was getting super defensive and like wanted everyone to leave. As George was walking up the stairs, Leonore had made a joke saying that, oh, he's gonna shoot himself now. And then William makes a joke back and says, haha, I'm not surprised if he's pulling the gun out right now. This whole interaction was actually revealed by Robert and said that it was really odd that they would just kind of add those details and then the outcome was just that. The newspaper article came out with Leonore's statement, and she said that she was only joking and didn't actually know the outcome of what was going to happen, which, come on, Leonore. If you're gonna lie, at least make it a good one, you know? I was only kidding. Girl, no, say that you have like psychic abilities or something. Where's the spice? George's therapist also revealed that a big contributing factor to him doing this essentially was mostly because of his stalled career. Since he was known as Superman, there wasn't really many superhero movies during the 50s, so there really wasn't that much demand for work for him. And since people knew him as Superman, it would be really weird to see him in like a musical theater or a romance film, thus leading him to a stalled career because, as I said, they weren't really paying actors very much back in the day. When the coroners and the police department came out with this theory, there was a lot of people that rejected this theory, which, like, obviously, who was actually going to believe that? Actually, an author by the name of E.J. Flemons, who dissected the whole death of George and pointed out all of the inconsistencies with this death that just didn't make sense. The first one being the placement. I feel like I'm like so low. I need like a booster seat. Do I just take one of these? I'm wearing sweatpants. Oh wow, you could see me so much better now. I was literally just like this, like a little hermit the entire time. One of the inconsistencies that EJ had pointed out was the placement of the bullet. It says in the report that he was shot in the right temple, yet on the ceiling, that is where the bullet was lodged. If you shot yourself in the right temple, would typically be on the floor or somewhere on the side of you. The only way for that to make sense is if his head was at like a horizontal tilt, and if that was the case and there was more weight, he would have fell forward and not backwards. Same thing with the gun. If he had the gun in his hand, it wouldn't have fell on the ground in between his legs, it would have just fell on the bed with him. Typically with these sort of cases, you see some sort of gunpowder on the hands or the face, but in this case there was no gunpowder on George's hands or face. The two biggest ones of the bullet casing being underneath Reeves, if he did shoot himself at a horizontal, the casing would have fell exactly where his head would be instead of like behind him and then he fell backwards. That just didn't really make sense. And also, why was he naked? If it really happened so quickly as all these four people are saying, how did he strip naked so fast? The mother of George actually came out and said like, yes, I do not agree with this theory either. There are so many inconsistencies. Why can't you guys see this? And demanded for the case to be reopened, but they refused. The second theory that people believed is that Lenore had actually shot George and the three others had covered for her. One thing about Lenore is that she was known for being a very hot-headed person. She would get angry very easily, throw tantrums when things weren't her way. They only knew each other for about 5 months until all of the sudden they were like planning to be married. It was said that at one point George actually felt very overwhelmed at the fact that everything was moving so quickly. He wanted to marry Lenore, just not right now. Lenore grew a lot of offense to this. It was kind of speculated that maybe Lenore, in the heat of the moment, shot George. I mean, like, the gun was literally in a bedside table. Like, it was very easily accessible. It didn't really have like a lock or anything on it. And also another key component of all of this, at the actual crime scene, the police found 2 bullet holes in the floor that were the same bullets from the gun that George had used. And when the police had asked Lenore about these bullet holes, she said that the first one resulted from a few days prior when Lenore had the gun and was just fooling around with it. And then the second one, she did not give an explanation for. Which again, Lenore, please, if you're gonna lie, at least make it a cool one, you know? Say that like, oh, I'm training for like a really huge high production movie and I needed to like to target practice on my floor and my husband. Oh God. And the chief of this investigation actually saw the bullets as well in the floor and said not important and had nothing to do with the case. Robert had mentioned how Lenore made that like very sly comment, oh, he's gonna shoot himself right now. Like, I don't know, I could kind of see that as a joke. In this situation, it just like looks very, very shady. And ironically, just a few days after George had passed away, Lenore fled off to New York with plans to never return to LA again. So she was never really questioned. She was never really suspected. She basically went to the funeral and dipped. A woman with a plan, gotta respect that. But the murder aspect, maybe a bad call. Honestly, girl boss, I'm just kidding. No, she definitely killed her husband or had something to do with it, you know? She should be like locked up forever. But yeah, so no one really said anything. And the main reason as to why people believe in this theory so much is because it was actually said that around this time he was getting doubts on like, oh, is this the woman I want to spend with for the rest of my life? I mean, I've only known her for 5 months. And when he started to contemplate the question of their marriage and if they actually should pursue it, he ended up actually calling calling off the marriage entirely. Lenore, she probably got extremely mad at that and shot her husband. The third and final theory of what happened to George was that he was professionally murdered by some higher superiors. That is because for most of the 50s, George was practically married to this woman named Tony. Now, the reason why they had that label practically married is because Tony was real married to a guy named Eddie. What Eddie did for a living is that he was the fixer in Hollywood. He worked for this guy named Louis B. Mayer, who was the head of MGM Studios. If anything shady was going on, he would quickly cover it up. Those things involved gambling, abortions, death, and even rape. So he would make sure that everything was covered up and the public didn't know anything about it. Also alleged that he worked very closely with the mob at the time. So he was able to kind of get those higher connections that no one could really get. So needless to say, with all of the experience that Eddie has had, he definitely has some experience in covering up a mess. What was actually kind of odd about this situation is that you would think that maybe Eddie found out about the whole affair and that's why he killed George. But Eddie was just like super on board with the whole affair thing. Like, he would literally just go attend their dates, and sometimes he would even bring his own mistress as well, all hang out together, which, like, oh my god, they would all go on like vacations together, dates together. It was actually kind of crazy, more of an open relationship situation. And even Eddie and George themselves had a very close relationship. Eddie was very rich while George really wasn't. Eddie had even bought George's car, house, and a lot of his clothes. Surprisingly, it wasn't the affair itself that might have led Eddie to do this, but it was the fact of Lenore coming into the picture. George unfortunately had to break it off with Tony because Lenore, it was very also like frowned upon to have very open relationships at the time. Like, it was believed that like husband, wife, and that was it. He was just looking for something long term, and he realized that he wasn't really going to get this long term with Tony. They were practically married to one another, and as Tony fell into her heartbreak, it kind of broke Eddie's heart a little bit that George would do something like this, and so that is why people believe that he was actually murdered by one of Eddie's companions. Now, the reason why people believe this theory is because there are a lot of consistencies with this case that actually just seem way too good to just be either a suicide or someone that didn't have experience with doing it before. When they went to the coroner's office, there was no gunpowder found on his face or his hands. When they were examining the gun for fingerprints, they had actually noticed that the gun was recently oiled, so there was no fingerprints found on it, as well as that room being the only room in the house that didn't have any windows in it. Tony was obviously very depressed and angry with George because she had even stole his dog, George's dog, as revenge. And also the neighbors just coming by at like 12 a.m. was such a big inconsistency, considering it was also a Tuesday night. It wasn't even like a weekend or anything like that. Like, people had work in the morning, so it was said that maybe those two neighbors came by more for a distraction rather than just like wanting to go there and hang out. So that is basically all of the theories regarding the death of George Reeves. May he rest in peace. As for me personally, Lenore, I got multiple eyes on her because, like, come on now, that woman, it's like that TikTok audio where it's like, he's dead? Oh no! That was literally Lenore, except she got on a plane to New York and never came back. The third and final conspiracy theory topic that I'm going to be discussing is the Salem Witch Trials. Pass me, yeah. I tried to make a joke, but then I forgot what I was gonna say like halfway through it. In the late 17th century, it was experienced a mass hysteria, and if you don't know what mass hysteria is, it's basically when a large group of people all fear of getting sick. Sounds familiar. But instead of people fearing of getting sick, people actually feared that evil beings were walking amongst them with like supernatural and luring powers that will bring you to the dark side. All of this was happening in Salem, Massachusetts. The Salem, Massachusetts was separated into two, the village and the town. And the village and the town kind of had a little bit of beef with one another. They didn't agree politically, they didn't agree culturally, but one thing that they did agree on was religiously. So that's the one thing that they did agree upon, that, you know, the Bible, their rule book, everything that the Bible says, they must obey it, and anyone that goes against it obviously should be dead, because what is the point of keeping you around if you don't believe in the Bible? Which, you know, unpopular opinion, a little intense. And then in 1689, a man named Samuel Parris actually became the first ordained minister of Salem, but no one really liked him because he was super shady. People just were like, yeah, that man is going to like kind of ruin us one day, which, I mean, they were right, because so I grabbed coffee because I feel like my energy wasn't top. Okay. Wow, I'm just kidding. Imagine. He moved there with his wife, his two daughters, his niece, and their slave Tatuba. And then in 1692, a few years later, that is when Sam and his wife started realizing that one of his daughters, who was 9 years old, and his niece, that was 11 years old, would quite frequently go missing, but nothing to raise like a big concern. They just kind of thought like, oh, they're just out playing in the woods or something like that, but they would be gone for a few hours at a time. But what they didn't know is that when the girls would run off, they were dabbling a little bit in fortune telling. It was, you know, like very playful and harmless. They weren't really doing anything to like bring back the dead. Like, oh, who am I gonna marry when I get older? Called like dream catchers, where it's like a pick a color, wow, you're gonna be awesome when you grow up. And also similar to that other game, you know, MASH, it was like, oh, you are going to live on a boat with 4 kids and a husband and have $1 million or something like that. I actually have never played MASH. I'm not a 90s kid. And it wasn't until February of 1692 where the two girls started to act a little bit strange. They started to do things like randomly scream, bark, run underneath furniture. Their body would convulse in like inhumane ways. If barking is a symptom of being possessed, take me away. So at first it was just the daughter doing this. A little while later, the niece started to follow the same exact behavioral patterns as well. The parents just didn't really know what to do, so they brought in a doctor and a priest, and they both diagnosed them with bewitchment and said that they could possibly not be the only ones, and that there are evil beings walking amongst them, hence the mass hysteria mentioned earlier. Other girls in the town were also starting to act like this. Girls who were singing in church would just like randomly scream really loud. Everybody was freaking out because people were thinking that maybe there was a demon amongst them that was like possessing a bunch of these young girls. Who the suspect was, who was the catalyst for all of this evil. And the first suspect was, I mean, unfortunately, Sam's slave, Tatuba. People were saying that Tatuba was actually luring young girls into the woods with her enchanting stories. She was the only person of color in that community. People are going to, you know, assume that it's her, unfortunately. She tried to defend herself so many times, but of course, people just ignored her and she got arrested anyways. Later down on the road, a 12-year-old girl and a 17-year-old girl was diagnosed with bewitchment, and when they were asked who this person was that caused them the bewitchment, they named 2 girls by the name of Sarah Osborne and Sarah Good. For Sarah Good, she was known for being like very religiously spoken about her personal ideals. She was always like getting into arguments with her neighbors about the Bible. She was also of lower class, so if she was arrested, she probably couldn't even get out of it. People speculated that she was involved in witchcraft, and her husband just like went along with it. Like, dude, why? That's so rude. He did not even hesitate to not defend his wife. He was just like, you know what? Yeah, I'm on board with that. Even though there was no physical evidence that pointed these 2 girls to be the catalyst, they were arrested anyways and put onto trial. Now, as for Sarah Osborne, the reason why she was speculated to be it because she actually had sex before marriage. But but you didn't hear it from me. A lot of people were already like frowned upon her and thought that she was a sinner, and so when people heard this news, they were like, you know what, it kind of adds up that she would perform witchcraft because she's doing it before marriage, and that's kind of the same thing. The only people being accused were either people of color or people of lower class. A lot of people weren't really like looking to the higher class people. It was mostly the lower class people that were being blamed for all of this, and that kind of ties into a conspiracy theory later on, so remember that. Big three main suspects: Tituba, Sarah Good, and Sarah Osborne. Now, Tituba was actually forced to confess. A tall man with a tall black hat had actually told her to do all of the things that she did, even though her story is probably false. They probably forced her into saying a story just to make the police's lives easier. Sarah Good actually argued her innocence and said, no, I'm not a witch. Tituba and Sarah Osborne are a witch. And so she was basically like saving herself while throwing the other two under the bus, which like didn't even help anything, because Sarah Good and Sarah Osborne were actually burned at stake because they were suspected witches. As for Tituba, since she was a slave, at the time slaves were held as property, so instead of just like burning her to teach her a lesson, they basically took her away from the family that she had and sold her off to a new owner. On July 29, 1692, Sarah Good plus 4 other women were publicly hung on the death sentence. Those 4 other women being Martha Corey, Dorothy Good, who was Sarah Good's 4-year-old daughter, Rebecca Nurse, and Rachel Clinton. 19 people died due to the Salem Witch Trials. 13 of them were women, 5 of them were men, and over 150 people were arrested. The reason why this whole thing is just extremely unfair is that the ways that they would determine who was a witch and who wasn't was like, it literally just made no sense. One of the tests that they would do was a swim test, where basically they would strip the person naked, throw them in the lake, and if they float, that means they were a witch, and if they sunk, that means they were innocent. If any of you guys know anything about, you know, being in water, you know that like our body just automatically floats. These are tests that just aren't really going to work out too well. They're not going to give you any other outcome. Then the next one was a prayer test. The suspected witches would be given scripture, and if they messed up speaking the scripture from the Bible, then that was a sign that they must be a witch. You wouldn't be human and making mistakes, obviously. So that was another. People would literally do something as small as stutter on their words or mess up a word from the scripture, and that was good enough evidence to them that this person was indeed a witch. Witches aren't really real. Only real witches live on TikTok. Everyone knows that. So the next one that they would do was called a witch cake. Is not as good as it sounds. It's actually quite disgusting. They would mix flour, ashes, and the urine of the suspected witch all into a cake. Yummy, yummy, yummy. Mix it up, mix it up. And like, what's crazy about this is that Tituba, the slave, during this time, they would literally like ask Tituba to make these cakes, and she'd be like, okay, and then she makes the cakes, and they'd be like, how did you know how to make that cake? You're a witch, aren't you? And she's like, you literally told me to do this? Are you kidding me? I literally just like forgot to finish the rest of that story. They would make the cake, whip it up, and then they put it in an easy bake oven, and then when the easy bake oven says it's ready, they fed the dog the cake, and if the dog started to get the same exact symptoms as a person diagnosed with bewitchment, that would be proof that the person was in fact a witch. Keep that in mind, because that actually comes in handy for one of the conspiracy theories. So those are the type of testings that they would perform. As you can tell, they are not the most accurate when it comes to these things. Now, there were 19 people that died due to the Salem Witch Trials, because a lot of these people were just innocent people that were just thrown into situations that they had nothing to do with, and then were like forced to confess. That kind of leads us into the conspiracies of why exactly this happened. Two main big big ones, and those are the two ones that we're going to discuss right now. The first one being the reason why people were acting like that in the beginning, you know, convulsing into inhumane positions, barking, mostly due to the crops in Salem. During the Salem Witch Trials, in the crops, there was this big fungus going around, kind of spreading in various crops, called the ergot fungus. If digested, these symptoms include manic, distorted perceptions, hallucination, dazed, and paralysis. Do these earrings match? A lot of historians believe that the reason why people were acting like that is because they were all digesting this fungus in the crop. And that's why they were reacting in those sort of inhumane type ways. And remember the witch cakes included flour from the crops. So when the dogs would have to eat these witch cakes, of course they would convulse and act differently because of the fungus in the crop. So that is just like what a lot of people believe and speculate what happened. Moral of that conspiracy: they were all tripping out and didn't know what to do, and so they thought that they were witches. The second conspiracy, and the most widely believed conspiracy theory, it was a way to eliminate the lower class and people of color living in the town. Tatuba was probably one of like very few people of color there, and also there was a lot of lower class. The people who died from the Salem Witch Trials were all people of lower class or people of color. That maybe this was something made by that shady minister Samuel Paris, who no one really liked since the beginning. Why this whole thing started with his daughters, because he kind of started the entire thing. He knew about the fungus and he kind of used that as a way to his advantage in order to eliminate the lower class and kind of raise up the town in itself. And that's also just like the conspiracy that I believe in the most as well, because I don't know, me personally, that just like makes the most sense to me. So that is all of the conspiracy and spooky stories I have for today. It was a lot of fun to make, and I kind of went for like this very sophisticated businesswoman with like the blazer, and I also have this ring. I got it at a flea market a few years ago, and it like literally does not fit like whatsoever. I just thought I'd slap it on because, you know, I thought I would be like a classy businesswoman. You know, she's married, she knows what time it is. Really hope you guys enjoyed, and if you did, make sure to give it a big thumbs up and subscribe. And thank you so much again to HelloFresh for sponsoring this video. Ad aside, because we're not in the ad anymore, that gnocchi was actually like really good. Should I put on lip gloss? Like a slight gloss? And I hope you guys have a beautiful rest of your day. Go outside while it's still warm outside. Before you know it, it's gonna be winter, and then we're gonna be stuck inside. Go on a walk. You can just literally go outside and sit down and just like breathe fresh air. Watch your favorite movie, watch your favorite TV show. My show right now is Breaking Bad. I go through like these things, I think I mentioned this before, where I watch Breaking Bad for like 2 weeks straight, and then I take a week break, and then I watch it for another like 2 weeks straight. Season 3 right now, Skylar, she needs to go. She really like she needs to go. Yeah, and like fast. I watched was, oh my god, watch 1BR. It's on Netflix. So good. This girl moves to LA by herself for the very first time to follow her LA dream. She gets accepted into this apartment building, and the very first night she's at this apartment, she hears a loud rattling in the pipes. So she goes up to the landlord the next day and is like, hey, these rattling pipes, they're super loud at night, like, can you please fix them? Few nights go by and the pipes do not stop rattling. So then she invites a friend over, and she expresses these concerns to her friend and says, hey, I can't even sleep at night because these pipes are so loud. And she's like, hey, you know, why don't you break your lease and we'll get a place together? And she's like, okay, great. And so that night she's sleeping and she hears the pipes, but then all of a sudden she goes out into her living room and she sees smoke coming from her stove, and she opens up the stove and her pet is in there freaking out, and she turns around and it's someone from the apartment building just standing in her place. And so she starts screaming, and then everyone from the apartment building comes into her room, gets knocked out, and then she wakes up in this plain white room, and she basically has entered this cult that the apartment building has. So this apartment building is just like one big cult, and she just entered herself into it, and she has no choice but to stay. She can't leave. They put her on lie detector machines and asks her questions of like, do you want to stay here? So they know for a fact if she's lying or not, or if she has intentions of leaving. That's basically the journey of like her trying to not get brainwashed into wanting to stay here, but also trying to like get out of there somehow. Really, really great movie. 10 out of 10, will recommend to you, and that is my movie suggestion for the week. So yes, I love you very, very much, and I hope you guys have a wonderful rest of your day and do something that makes you happy today.